Violence and hostility against Jews are stable for centuries. But how could that happen? It all began during the Middle Ages and with the concept of the ritual murder legend. It was, and sadly is, the most successful conspiracy tale of all time. It says that Jews ritually murder Christian children, primarily boys, in a cruel way for religious reasons. We can still see the persistence of the legend everywhere. For example, what is certain is that there has never been a Jewish ritual murder. In his essay published in 2019 on the role of money in anti-Jewish ideas of the Middle Ages, Sebastian Pieringer feels compelled to make this remark. He's not alone. This legend is still spread to our immediate present, attests Rainer Erb, for example, and adds that there was no corresponding murder. The editors of the English-language version of the hagiography William of Norwich, published at the end of the 19th century, also offer a note to this effect. At present, the evidence for a ritual murder is simply nil. These references are due to necessity in the case of the ritual murder legend. To this day, people believe the accusations that the Jews kidnapped Christian children, torture them, and drink their blood. In research, this topicality is not only palpable through denials. Two examples of leading researchers on this topic should be mentioned. Erb does not end his account until the 20th century. Maria E. Dorninger notes that the legend continues to have an impact on the modern age. In 2020, however, the legend gained a special relevance away from science and is part of political disputes. The conspiracy tale QAnon revisited the myth in a barely changed form and helped it gain new popularity. The question arises as to the reasons for the permanence of the legend. After all, there was already active opposition to the accusations in the Middle Ages. Frederick III, for example, campaigned so strongly against them in Regensburg that he was given the reputation of a Jewish king. Other rulers and popes acted similarly. In 1236, Frederick II granted a privilege for the protection of the Jews. In the same year, Pope Gregory IX demanded that the French King Louis IX protected them against Crusaders' excesses. Innocent IV defended it against false accusations in a bull in 1247. He described the accusations as fabrications and complained that the Jews lived worse under the princes of his time than under the pharaohs. The Pope repeatedly pointed to the theological justified duty of the Church to protect the Jews. Eventually, the cities did the same. Frankfurt, for example, authenticated Innocent's bull in June 1287. Such appeals went unheeded. As early as the 13th century, the legend of ritual murder had become so entrenched that even the disappearance of Christian children led to pogroms or targeted expulsions. This touches on another point that makes the question of the reason all the more urgent. An accusation of ritual murder, often in combination with the accusation of sacrilege against the host, almost always led to excesses of violence. Nevertheless, the veracity of the accusations was hardly seriously questioned. The legend had evidently burned itself deeply into the general consciousness as true. Following on from this consideration, further questions arise in addition to the causes of the persistence of the ritual murder myth. How can the difference in perception regarding the truth of the accusations between the general public and the elites be explained? How did the legend, including the accusation of sacrilege against the host, spread? Why were the attempts at protection by the rulers unsuccessful? Why have the justifications for the ever-escalating violence not been questioned? All these questions will be addressed by this video, because research has not yet been able to answer any of them satisfactorily. Jörg R. Müller offers an interesting approach to the search for explanations. Attempts at reconstruction must be based primarily on the historiographical sources written by Christian authors. These were primarily used for memoria. That means for the remembrance on special things. They therefore provide the opportunity to tap into the quote prevailing mentalities and attitudes of the time, especially towards the Jews. Inherently, therefore, there is another option. We can approach the culture of remembrance of the time. This is defined as the socially and culturally determined group memory. So all the memories you share together in a certain group. This means that large groups up to and including societies can be found in connections through shared memories. These are deliberately stored to provide orientation. Inevitably, this must also apply to the ritual murder legend, the accusations accompanying it, accusations of blood and host sacrilege, as well as to the Jews. However, it remains to be seen whether a culture of remembrance can be created through control. Researchers are divided on this question. Peter Heil, for example, assumes a self-organizing process. On the other hand, Christoph Cornelissen, for example, points out the special role of symbolic and mythical forms of expression. These are created by humans, therefore it can at least be assumed that later societies will collectively remember certain events in a special way. This reminder does not necessarily have to obey the facts. Such concerns can be traced back to the medieval monasticism and its systemized form of commemorating the dead. Thomas Wünsch speaks of the fact that this is, quote, to a certain extent, the archetype of the culture of remembrance. Consequently, it is an attempt to permanently anchor one's own interpretation of certain processes or evaluations of actors. Norbert Frey has proposed the term politics of the past to describe the attempt to gain interpretative sovereignty by means of the culture of remembrance in the field of political action. The ritual murder legend and the violence against the Jews undoubtedly have a religious dimension, but also a political one. Eventually, the events affected secular coexistence. The mechanism that the key players did not only act out of spiritual motives, but also had an interest in later generations remembering the events in a certain way, therefore also applied here. Or to put it simply, politics of the past was pursued. Further considerations are therefore based on the following thesis. All those involved had the wish that their actions in the present and future appear justified. They are therefore wanted to anchor their view permanently. The excesses of violence and the violation of the commandments of the authorities were in need of explanation. The legend of ritual murder and the accusations of sacrilege against the host provided sufficient legitimacy for these acts. Initially, it was about the creation of martyr cults. The action against the Jews was therefore to be equated with the advocacy of a saint. The victims support this. They were young children, as I mentioned, mostly boys. This was due to the fact that, according to Christian belief, man gradually loses their innocence after baptism. The quality of sacrifice therefore appeared to be higher in children of low age. It is easy to think that this is alone one of the reasons why the myth has been able to survive to the present day. Adolescents are particularly in need of protection. Actions can therefore be easily justified if appropriate legitimacy is cited. Pieringer uses similar arguments. One of the reasons for the establishment of the ritual murder fable was that the Jews had thus forfeited their protected status. This leads to another basic assumption. Martyr cults were at the beginning, but for other reasons, the Jews were anchored in the culture of remembrance as child murderers. The ritual killing no longer had the primary goal of spiritually elevating the victim. It was the accepted explanation for the otherwise condemnable acts of violence against the Jews. Müller notes, for example, that Johannes of Winterthur did not doubt the ability of the Jews to commit the brutal murders, even though he knew that they were also wrongly accused. The chronicler did not question the accusations in his work. They were apparently an accepted narrative. Following this thesis, an upward spiral of justification can be identified. With each new act of violence, the need arose to anchor it in the memory as legitimate. Although unquestionably other interests fueled the violence, which will be discussed later, there was not a single moment when previous action were judged wrong. This would have led to the end of violence. Confessions extracted under torture by Jewish defendants instead served as a means of self-assurance. In the end, however, this act was just another act of violence that had to be justified in writings of all kinds, from the lives of saints to historiography. Ritual murder was presented as an established fact of a repeated Jewish crime. The Jews served as an explanation for all evil. This idea gained an apodictic validity and made them appear like the devil. These theses offer answers to some open questions. They show why hatred of Jews did not manifest itself violently until the High Middle Ages. There had already been accusations against the Jews that they had murdered children. In the 5th century, for example, they are said to have beaten a boy to death. On such occasions, however, there was no excuse to stand up for a martyr in order to act collectively against the Jews. At the same time, the theses explain why the accusations of blood and host, which arose after the original ritual murder legend, also spread quickly. They were another tool to excuse the violence. The postulates also illustrate why the ritual murder legend hardly played a role during the plague. Other accusations, such as the poisoning of the well, took their place as a suitable excuse. And finally, the theses illustrate why the ritual murder legend was able to persist into the modern era. The apology of violence has spiraled so high that the legend has become a justification of anti-Semitism and is therefore believed in some places to this day. In order to support the views presented, it is necessary to point out the converging research approaches that serve as the basis for the reflections. The social sciences also offer assistance in order to go beyond the results of previous research. For example, studies on the roots of radicalization processes have only emerged in recent years and have therefore not yet played a role in the problem area discussed here. Conflict research also provides analytical tools to describe the necessity and legitimacy of violence. In this context, the additional motives should play a role in addition to the mere violence, which should be covered up by the justification of the accusation of ritual murder and the accusations of sacrilege against the host. It was about the neutralization of individual and collective guilt. The assumption is that these motives favored the turning of the fateful spiral. Before that, however, an in-depth examination of the spread of the ritual murder legend is necessary. In this way, it is possible to identify the key players who carried them forward. In addition, the way in which it was disseminated also shows the conflicts that arose as a result of which protective mechanisms for the Jews failed. An analysis of the failed bans deepens this aspect. Finally, there is a more in-depth discussion of the question of the extent to which a culture of remembrance can be consciously generated and consolidated. The final conclusion brings together the results of the analysis and the theoretical considerations to provide answers. As far as the sources are concerned, the following applies. There are fortunately too many to be fully taken into account. For example, the Digital Archive Marburg and the Medieval Ashkenaz Research Project offer numerous relevant testimonies online. An exemplary selection is intended to support the central considerations. These are mainly documents, chronicles, and the hagiography of William of Norwich. Friedrich Lothar outlined the central findings on the spread of ritual murder. In his essay published in 1993, he shows that this was mainly done orally. These were vernacular mendicant sermons, as Christoph Kluse was to add. These became increasingly important from the 13th century onwards. We owe Rainer Erb our knowledge of the consequences of the accusations. Accordingly, these almost always resulted in violence. It was not until the 15th century that pogroms ceased to occur in every case. Erb also emphasizes the importance of introducing the Inquisition process. This was a quote turning point through the establishment of files. As a result, the transmission had become increasingly precise. In this way, the prosecutors had already known what the contents of the confession had to be before the torture of the accused. Erb concludes that the legend was widely passed on through chronicles, narrative literature, and the trial protocols. Eventually, the Jews confessed to end the torture. The myth, therefore, ultimately no longer needed any theological substance. This may give a further explanation as to why the prohibitions on accusations of the popes and rulers came to nothing. They were beyond their authority. Job van Benning has come to terms with the complicated relationship between the Vatican and the Roman German crown and the ritual murders. He shows that the papacy in particular had actually vigorously spoken out against the corresponding accusations. Pope Sixtus IV, for example, forbade the veneration of Simon of Trent as a martyr and refused to include him in the list of saints, knowing that the background was false accusations. In this example, van Banning also indirectly demonstrates that the popes were well aware that the establishment of martyr cults was the original driving force behind the accusations. With reference to Pope Martin V, the author also illustrates that the highest princes of the church were aware of the roles of the monks in the dissemination. The popes had criticized the clerics for not accusing the Jews on theological grounds, but using the sermons to strengthen their authority over their audience. In some cases, they would also speak out of personal hostility towards Jews, as the Jews refused to believe their word. The dimension of violence in interaction with the creation and transmission of the ritual murder legend has been the subject of some researchers' work. Marie-France Roy, for example, traces the difficult relationship between Judaism and Christianity. In the 5th century, there was a missionary competition between the two religions. The Jews had polemicized against the Christians in order to make the religions distinguishable. In the case of ritual murder, this was reversed. The Christians had instrumentalized the Jews in order to link their stories with the devil, ritual bleeding, crucifixions, and cannibalism. These stereotypical accusations apparently found a hearing with the Jews as the perpetrators. The creation of legends had two levels, the clergy and the laity. The former, according to Roy, made the accusations primarily to prevent the miracles of martyrs. The laity, on the other hand, focused on the anthropophagic aspects that demanded accountability. Józef Niewiadomski has focused on the propensity for violence in Christian Europe in the High and Late Middle Ages. As a result of the Crusades, it had succumbed to a bloodlust. These would have produced a form of piety that re-sacralized violence as an instrument of religious practice. The commandment not to kill had given rise to an allowance or even an obligation to kill infidels. The accusations of ritual murder followed the, quote, logic of the negative foil. The Christians cleansed their consciousness by the insinuations. The Jews were incomparably more cruel in comparison and seemed to have deserved death. Violence became a legitimate punitive measure. A transmission of violence would therefore not only be possible but necessary. The misdeeds of the Jews must be made known to the world. The pillaging, murdering Christian becomes invisible in the context of such a tradition. He, meaning the Christian, can continue to perceive himself as pious and good, according to Niewiadomski, who aptly describes the medieval interest of individual Christians in a lasting legitimation of their deeds. He also deals with the self-apology of the perpetrators. According to this, the Christians followed the argument that the Jews had taken advantage of God himself by crucifying Jesus. They are therefore so evil that the question of the purification of Christians becomes secondary. Wolfgang Wippermann has delved deeper into the narrative of the, quote, evil Jew that underlies this logic. It shows that the Jews were deliberately associated with the devil on a regular basis. For example, there had been accusations that they would meet with him secretly again and again. This led to an equation of the Jews with the Antichrist. In research, however, there's also an opposite approach to justify the origin of the ritual murder legend. This refers to growing socio-cultural differences between the two religions. Willard Paul Eckert exemplifies this approach. Quote, "The ritual murder thesis is ultimately explained by the deep estrangement between Christians and Jews in the Middle Ages, especially in its final phase. There had been a deep mass fear of the Jews as strangers and therefore uncanny. The accusations were projections of ideas. Diane Zahler, who focuses on economic issues, argues in a similar vein. The Jews had become rich as moneylenders. As a result, the rejection of Christians against them has grown. Sebastian Pieringer fittingly demonstrates that Jewish ushery was essential for the conspiracy tales. However, this line of research has a problem to contend with. In the 12th century, Thomas of Monmouth made massive accusations against the Jew in his hagiography of William of Norwich, which apparently bore fruit. This suggests that he reproduced well-known and accepted stereotypes, because otherwise it couldn't have been bore fruit. The alienation must have happened well before that. Pieringer, for example, attests to Bernhard of Clairvaut's knowledge that his audience knew the entire repertoire of anti-Jewish stereotypes. It therefore seems right to emphasize the increasing alienation of religions. After all, they lived peacefully together in the territory of today's Germany for about 100 years. There must therefore have been a development. However, it is not enough to focus only on the high and late Middle Ages. Anti-Jewish stereotypes and resentments that had previously arisen formed the fertile ground on which the legend of ritual murder and later the accusations of sacrilege against the host could fall. However, it also seems doubtful whether the Crusades were actually responsible for this. Finally, there were the first pogroms in the run-up to the First Crusade. Therefore, it remains to be said that research cannot offer the beginning of the anti-Jewish developments. However, it is able to show that hostility towards Jews was widespread in the high and late Middle Ages. It encountered a Christianity that considered it its duty to fight the enemies of its own religion. The Jews therefore became victim. The ritual murder legend, although not invented for this purpose, became a fig leaf for one's own deeds. It corresponded with the existing image of Jews and thus convened that they had forfeited their protected status. The justification for violence was given. Research cannot answer why the attempts to invalidate the corresponding legitimation came to nothing. The theoretical findings on the different form of violence and their justification strategies can help to close the gap. This will be shown in the chapters to come. As already mentioned, the spread of the ritual murder legend in Europe began with the hagiography of William of Norwich. It took only a few years for the story to become known in the whole of Europe. In her essay on the accusations of ritual murder in the Middle Ages, Dorninger offers an enumeration of how quickly similar accusations were able to spread across the continent. Within 40 years, such accusations appeared in France, Flanders, and the Iberian Peninsula, for example. However, there was still one aspect missing that became an integral part of the myth in the 13th century: the alleged use of Christian blood by the Jews, later known as a blood accusation. There was a reason for this that the original author, Thomas of Monmouth, may have been aware of. Jews are prohibited from consuming blood for religious reasons. Their belief is that the soul of the deceased living being resides in it, which is why enjoyment is not permitted. Enjoyment is to be seen as a quote here, please. About 100 years after Thomas of Monmouth, it was Thomas of Contemporary who added to the legend in his work Bonum Universale de Apibus. He argued that God had punished the Jews with an excruciating flow of blood that would not stop until they converted to Christianity. The Jews, for their part, were convinced that they could alleviate their suffering by shedding Christian blood. The Dominican wrote those lines between 1259 and 1270. For the year 1280, the unknown author of the Liber Chronicorum Erfodensis wrote an entry about the murder of a girl from Thuringia, which seems to have been clearly inspired by the work of Contemporary. It is unclear how Contemporary became aware of the blood allegations. He may have been aware of the case from Fulda in 1235. Two Jews confessed under torture that they needed the blood of an innocent children for magical or ritual purposes. The case eventually went all the way to Emperor Frederick II and may therefore have gained national attention as some citizens of Fulda demanded the punishment of the Jews throughout the empire. The monarch had this case examined and was subsequently convinced of the innocence of the Jews, which is why he issued a privilege of protection for them. Apparently, however, this was not enough to take away the power of the accusations. They continued to spread. As examples, shortly after the alleged murder in Thuringia, the beggar boy Werner in 1287 and a boy in Munich are also said to have been victims of similar acts on the territory of today's Germany. Werner's body was found near Bacharach. However, since no Jews had lived here for several years, those of the neighboring village were unceremoniously blamed. In Munich, a Christian woman who was caught kidnapping a child confessed that she had been bribed by Jews to hand over adolescents to them. In those cases, there were massacres among the Jewish population. From 1290 onwards, the accusation of sacrilege against the host was added to the ritual murder legend. For the first time, it has been proven for Paris. It spread as fast as the ritual murder legend. As noted above, Frederick was not only the only ruler who defended Jews against the corresponding accusations. The explanations so far about the spread of the ritual murder legend in the Middle Ages reveal two processes. First, it was a pan-European phenomenon that was quickly carried on. Second, attempts by those in power to protect the Jews and stop the spread of the legend were unsuccessful. Examples are given below. Until now, researchers have mainly considered the two questions separately. However, it seems more plausible to see connections between the trials. The speed of the spread points to processes that were so strong that they made the effective protection of Jews by the rulers impossible. For the initial creation of martyr cults, it took people of other faiths as perpetrators, who killed Christian children because of their faith. The Jews came into focus as the most suitable culprits for this purpose. The accusations of ritual murder was suitable as a tool to achieve the goal. The precedent of William of Norwich created a functioning combination of martyrdom, ritual murder, and miracles. This is shown by the other examples of Harold of Gloucester in 1168 and Richard of Pontoise in 1182. The cultivation of antipathy towards Jews was readily accepted for this purpose. For example, it has always been part of such myths to ridicule a Christian victim. This aspect has not been absent from any anti-Jewish narratives. Accusations of ritual murder were also later made to justify the expulsion of Jews. The assets of the displayed persons often benefited the distributors. A financial motive may therefore also be assumed. Heinz Dorpsch can confirm this with the example of Salzburg. One of the next chapters takes a closer look at this economic dimension. At this point, it should suffice to point out that they existed. None of these goals, however, satisfactorily explains why the protections of emperors and popes, quote, often had little practical effect. How exactly the allegation spread also remains open. In the Middle Ages, the latter was probably primarily done via clerical networks, as these were the only ones to reach across the continent and the participants had sufficient education. However, this can be supported above all by anecdotal episodes. Preachers, for example, often incited hatred against Jews, such as the work of Bernardino da Faltre, who laid the foundation for the trial of the case of Simon of Trent. Peter of Amiens had already agitated against the Jews before the First Crusade, thus preparing the, quote, ground for mass suggestions. in Blois in 1171. It was fanatical Christians who, against the will of the secular authorities, burned alive 38 Jews after the death of a child, convinced of their guilt. Erb also mentions the returning crusaders who were aware of the Byzantine tradition of sacrilege against cult images. Above all, the accusations of sacrilege against the host showed similar features. Nevertheless, the exact distribution remains unclear. We do know, however, that in the 13th and 14th centuries, accusations made once in one region led to further accusations in the same area. So the accusations obviously spread quickly locally. The generally low level of knowledge about its dissemination changed at the end of the Middle Ages. For the first time, printed literature was widely used in the course of the Trent trial in order to achieve an agitational effect. This was initiated by the bishop himself. Thousands of copies spread the legend of Simon, which found its place in the Schädel Chronicle in 1493, for example. The authorship of the bishop also suggests that it was already clerical networks that provided for the dissemination. Sebastian Pieringer therefore rightly attests to the steadily growing discrepancy between the individual levels of the clergy regarding their own positions on the anti-Jewish accusations for the entire Middle Ages. However, before these points can be further problematized, it is important to describe another phenomenon that will be crucial for this violence. It was, after all, the manifestation of the rejection and hatred generated by the accusations. From the beginning of the late Middle Ages, the ritual murder legend, together with other accusations, was repeatedly the subject of discussion at the highest political and spiritual levels. Popes and rulers could not have condemned and banned the accusations of ritual murder with clearer words. To give a few examples, Innocent IV, in his aforementioned bull of 1247, spoke of inventions that had infuriated many people. The oppressors should be put to rest by spiritual coercion without further calling, he demanded. The Jews had turned to him in their fear of complete annihilation. Pope Gregory X demanded ecclesiastical punishment for all persons who spread blood accusations. He denounced the fact that some Christians secretly hide children in order to blame it on the Jews. Frederick II confirmed the privileges that his grandfather Frederick Barbarossa had given to the Jews of Worms and extended them to all of the empire. At the same time, he forbade the Jews to be harassed again because of the accusations of ritual murder. He even forbade making the accusations at all. Pope Sixtus IV forbade the veneration of Simon of Trent as a martyr and refused to inscribe him on the list of saints. Pope Martin V forbade ritual murder sermons directed against the Jews. This list could be extended considerably, but today it is little more than a testimony to the fact that contemporaries already knew about the truth of the accusations and that the bans failed. There were two main reasons for this. These worked together, and those in power themselves unconsciously laid the foundation for both phenomena. First, mixed signals made it possible to find viable excuses. Second, the bans drew attention to the accusations in the first place. It is no secret that the church, the popes, as well as kings and emperors were often hostile to Jews and repeatedly communicated and demonstrated this without any doubt. One of the best known examples is the decision of the Fourth Lateran Concile of 1215. They spoke, for example, of the faithlessness of the Jews. These would have exhausted the wealth of the Christians in a short time. They also mistakenly mixed with Christian women and therefore had to wear special clothes to be recognizable. Emperor Sigismund expressed himself similarly in a letter to the Augsburg Council. The Jews were therefore presumptuous and arrogant. They dress almost like Christians, but they are not worthy of it. In the cities, those in power also sent anti-Jewish signals. In 1347, for example, the Council of Cologne declared that it did not consider the privileges granted to the Jews to be compatible with the greater good of the city. Innocent III forced the Jews to forgive the Crusaders the interest on their debts. And this list could be extended considerably further than the above one. The Jews, like the Christians, made an universal claim. Inevitably, this led to a conflict. This ecclesiastical tradition made Christians the opponents of the Jews. There was a prohibition of violence and commitment to mission by the Christians. Until then, however, the humiliation of the Jews was seen as a permanent punishment and as a testimony to Christian truths that one's own religion was the only true one. Accordingly, the idea of a hierarchy and the exercise of one's own dominance were part of the self-image. The Archbishop of Lyon, for example, had anti-Jewish pamphlets distributed in 828, written by himself, in which he complained about how rejected the Jews were. The fruit of their womb is cursed. The Merovingian Chilperich had Jews imprisoned who did not want to be baptized. In the first half of the 11th century, they were accused of destroying churches and persecuting Christians in the Arabian Peninsula. Presumably, it was also at this time that the conspiracy narrative arose that Muslims and Jews had joined forces against the Christians. This was later spread mainly to the Iberian Peninsula. Alan Harris and Helen Elmquist Cutler even argue that Christian hostility towards Jews grew out of Christian Islamophobia. The church and the rulers had even exercised physical and psychological violence against the Jews, and was therefore not a question of whether their prohibitions on the use of force were absolute. It was about the circumstances under which breaches of the rules could be excused or justified. Those who took action against the Jews instead of the authorities could declare this to themselves and others to actually act in their interest and, for example, to do what a prince was too weak to do. Alternatively, it was also possible to justify that the representatives of the secular and/or spiritual power had been bribed or negatively influenced by the Jews. In this case, too, the perpetrators saw themselves legitimized by simply acting in the form that the authority should have done but failed to do so. It has already been hinted at, the exact distribution of the ritual murder legend is in the dark. The fact that it became known throughout the continent makes it plausible that it was passed on by people who had correspondingly extensive networks, such as itinerant preachers. It remains unclear how themselves came to know. What is striking is how similar the stories were. This suggests that the churchmen had access to the same sources of information. The so-called Streisand Effect could have been a phenomenon at work here, which the social science have only been able to describe comprehensively for a few years, but which can be traced far back in history. Specifically, it's about communication between partners in asynchronous power relations. The person or group with the greater influence is trying to suppress a certain piece of information that should be disseminated by the other side. However, by virtue of its prominent position, the more powerful party achieves exactly the opposite. It draws attention to the phenomenon and awakens the need for more information among innocent bystanders. One of the most famous examples is that of the Greek Herostratos. In the 4th century before Christ, he set fire to one of the 7 wonders of the world. His punishment was that he should be forgotten forever. Instead, he became part of history. The Roman damnatio memoria had a similar effect. For example, Nero, who is still one of the most famous Roman emperors today, became its victim. The few scientific studies of the Streisand Effect describe that a David versus Goliath phenomenon is occurring. The weaker feels challenged by the attempts of the stronger to suppress the information he is trying to pass on. This attracts attention. In this regard, the social science speak of a signal to the masses to look for more information. The Streisand effect also occurs in time of crisis. Research uses the term censorship to describe the real goal of the more powerful party. This can be characterized by different categories. The existence of censorship is hidden. The goals of censorships are degraded in order to distract from the actual censorship. Actions are reinterpreted by lying. Official channels are used to give the appearance of legitimacy. The power advantage is used to intimidate the opponents. Some of these features can be found in the examples above. The medieval rulers used official channels and threatened punishments. Only Frederick II openly admitted censorship because he even forbade future expressions of the accusations. The popes in particular simply absolved the Jews of the charges. True, this is not directly an attempt to hide the fact that it was about suppressing information, but it points in that direction. The Streisand effect would therefore mean that it was only the prohibitions of those in power that drew the attention of the broad masses to the ritual murder legend. Popes, emperors, king and other princes had an infrastructure to disseminate news. Even through their offices, they were sure to attract attention. Itinerant preachers were often intended as multipliers in their respective national languages. Bishops could play a similar role, for example by publishing corresponding documents in their dioceses. The same way was true for sovereign or regional nobles. 2 points are important here. First, there was no fixed control mechanism for those in power as to whether their messages were being conveyed correctly. Popes, for example, who wrote to all the princes of the empire, could not be sure of this for pragmatic reasons. This may also have been the reason why the Jews repeatedly asked various rulers to confirm the prohibitions. Second, priority should be given to those groups that spread the legends instead. There are several possible explanations for this. For example, the itinerant preachers did not want to contradict themselves. Possibly, however, it was only through the bands that they became aware of the details of the ritual murder legend and saw their image of the Jews confirmed by them. Political opportunists were given their justifications. This not only closes the gap to the previous chapter, but also shows that the bands failed. Not at least because those in power could not guarantee their dissemination and enforcement. There was too much interest in using the accusations as excuses for the violence. Guilt is always the decisive criterion when it comes to violence and justification. If such actions are taken, the corresponding question always arises. The first point of view touches on the subject: who caused the act of violence? Guilt and responsibility do not have to be congruent. Sanctions such as prison sentences, fines, corporal punishment, or even executions are subsequently imposed by a court or, for example, a monarch. For their part, these are the use of force which, in addition to punishment, are intended to have a preventive effect. The responsibility lies with the body that imposes the sanction. This is what determines the nature, scope, duration, and persons involved of the next act. However, the blame is attributed to the person who has to endure the sanction. According to the general perception, he has made sanction necessary by a violation of the rules, his own act of violence, for example. Two main conclusions can be drawn for this topic. First, according to the biblical eye for an eye, violence is a justification for using violence against the original perpetrator. However, this may be left to designated bodies. Second, acts of violence can be differentiated according to whether guilt and responsibility lie in the same hands or with the same group of people, or whether a separation must be made. As already indicated above, this is comparatively simple for individual violence. Apart from self-defense and rescue situations, guilt and responsibility are always in the same hands. For collective violence, it's much more complicated. This is where the connections are decisive. Research has therefore identified different forms. First, institutional violence. It aims at a permanent relationship of dependence and subjugation. The practitioners are endowed with the generally recognized power to impose and force sanctions. However, they are often subject to certain rules. For example, they may or are at least required not to punish bodily injury in the same way as robbery. It is generally accepted that the blame for their use of force always lies with the sanctioned persons. Structural violence. Johann Galtung's approach describes acts of violence that result from systematic structures and cause, for example, mass impoverishment. Guilt and responsibility may or may not be in the same hands. Structural violence includes actions by the institutions or the persons commissioned by them, as well as acts by private groups among themselves. Cultural violence. According to Galtung, this serves to justify structural violence. The above-mentioned example of Sigismund's letter to the Council of Augsburg, in which the emperor found the Jews unworthy to dress like Christians and therefore added that they should be visibly separated and recognized as Jews. The act of violence is not of a physical nature, but is intended to change the culture of coexistence between Christians and Jews. Due to the unworthiness of the latter, they should be easier to recognize. In this case, the real structural power comes from the council, which enforces the labeling. Sigismund only provides the legitimacy. Cultural violence then changes the moral coloring of structural violence from wrong to right. Symbolic violence. Galtung considers cultural violence to be symbolic violence. In principle, he describes the latter as any form of violence in which there is no clear line between the perpetrators and the people who have to endure it. This form is used, for example, in language, in religion, or in science. Inflammatory writings, for example, can encourage acts of violence. Symbolic violence in other forms. However, Galtung is not the only one who has coined the concept of symbolic violence and provided it with his own explanation. Pierre Bourdieu, for example, did the same, but with a different meaning. For him, the expression refers to power relations that are not openly admitted and are to be transfigured. Discrimination and violence are inherent in the science system itself. This violence is produced in particular in culture-producing institutions such as schools. Another form of symbolic violence refers only to the ability to express oneself verbally, for example by shouting at an inferior or deliberately slandering him. Ritualized or staged violence. It takes place in predetermined path, serves as a specific purpose, and takes place with the consent of the people involved. An example of this would be religious offerings. In connection with the Jews, however, there is also the deliberate choice of suicide in order to avoid death at the hands of the attackers. This happened, for example, during the pogroms before the First Crusade. These forms do not have to occur in isolation, but can mix. Institutional and structural violence, for example, are more likely to occur together. The identification of the Jews in Augsburg is an example of this. Sigismund refers to the Jews as our chamberlains, using a frequently used phrase in medieval documents of rule. On the one hand, it makes clear that the Jews are under imperial protection. On the other hand, however, it also indicates an existing relationship of subjugation. The Jews are permanently in the power of the emperor and are directly dependent on him. In the context of the Jews, a special combination of the above form is relevant, which is described as political ideological violence. The name denotes the motive of the action. Violence serves to create a new order and is directed against an enemy who makes it impossible or endangers it. So he is to blame for obstructing the plan. Political ideological violence is a mixture of structural, symbolic, and institutional violence. In the case of the Jews, all three or only two of the forms, no approval of violence by official bodies, could work together. However, it is advisable to reduce the term to ideological violence in order to describe the situation of the Jews. In this way, there is no need to take into account the systematic difficulties that govern the use of political ideological violence. In addition, the abbreviation indicates that ideological acts of violence can also take place completely independently of political office holders and/or official bodies. This seems more appropriate for the situation in the Middle Ages, which gave much greater freedom to private violence. Put it simply, one's own ideology shifts the blame from the perpetrators to the victims. Ideological violence is a combination of structural, symbolic, and/or institutional violence, offers a further advantage for this video, and is able to close the gap that needs to be explained between the fact that Jews were often victims of violence, but were also able to live relatively peacefully for long periods of time. The ideological component allows the perpetrators of violence to choose the severity of the application. The violence can manifest itself in intolerable ways, for example through targeted assassinations, but it is also capable of confining itself to acceptable actions. A good example of this is provided by the central source of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The General Edict is dated March 31st, 1492. In it, the royal couple, Ferdinand and Isabella, referred to an assembly of the estates in 1480, which stipulated that Jews had to live separately from Christians. They were to feel remorse in their separation. For a few years, this form of exclusion seemed to be enough for them. The life of the Jews was restricted by the king's power, but it was not made impossible. This changed in 1492. The Jews wanted to, quote, destroy the faith according to the royal couple in the edict. This is done by allowing Christians to participate in their culture. They would therefore have to leave Spain or die. This is the only way to avert the damage. Consequently, the violence against the Jews did not manifest itself in an intolerable way, until 12 years after the original decision of the Assembly of the Estates. After all, it was only now that the loss of life was imminent. The action starts from the crown, the latter possesses the institutional power. The reference to the assembly of the estates reveals the structural violence. The system is designed to exclude the Jews. The accusation that they want to destroy the faith contains the ideological component. At the same time, cultural violence is hidden here as the crown claims to protect Christianity. Ideology is therefore at the same time the essential justification of violence. It makes the Jews the culprits. Violence requires not only outward explanations but also internal justifications. This means that a person must be able to answer for a corresponding action before himself. A shift of blame to the victims must also be believed oneself. In 1958, Gresham M. Sykes and David Metzer presented the neutralization thesis, which is still relevant today. This assumes that perpetrators of violence can learn certain techniques to ease their own conscience and circumvent otherwise effective social controls. The techniques, according to Sykes and Metzer, are blaming the victim. The perpetrators of violence believe that the victims deserve their blaming the victim. The perpetrators of violence believe that the victims deserve what they inflict on them. For the Jews, we often encounter this technique and is therefore central to further considerations. However, the other techniques also play a role. Rejection of responsibility. Perpetrators, for example, see themselves as victims of adverse social circumstances or argue that they have been forced to commit these acts by social conditions. Rejection of injustice. The actors trivialize the act and do not recognize it was wrong. Stupid boy, pranks, or useful things would be example of this. Prosecution. Perpetrators of violence accuse their accusers, such as the authorities, of misworking and or acting in a corrupt, unjust, or self-serving manner. Appeal to a higher authority. For example, the act was committed on the basis of orders or peer pressure. An appeal to a religious authority is also conceivable if one's own actions are contrary to the laws or instructions of the highest secular powers. Unconsciously and unintentionally, Kurt Weiss and Sandra S. Borges developed the first neutralization technique in 1973. Further, they were describing the phenomenon of supposedly legitimate victims. Basically, they were concerned with the background of rapes that were never reported. The central thesis was that perpetrators of violence considered victims to be legitimate because of certain stigmatizations, meaning they got what they deserved. Numerous observations support this thesis. Research has therefore raised its inherent knowledge to a general level. This is a quote of the work. By demonizing them, attributing a number of negative traits to them, denouncing their idiosyncrasies or behavior, questioning their loyalty, degrading their worth, status, role, and achievement, disparaging and de-integrating them, certain groups are selected by society as appropriate or even culturally legitimate targets of violence and other forms of victimization. Also, by portraying these groups as guilty or reprehensible in any way or culture, encourages violence against members of this group as victimization thus seems justified. Hate crimes are almost exclusively directed against groups that are marginalized and stigmatized by the ruling members of a society. These attributions are called victim attributes. If potential perpetrators of violence identify such predisposing factors, they serve as a neutralization for subsequent actions. In the Middle Ages, this neutralization technique even existed in the legal form of the ban. It therefore seems logical that it was also used unconsciously and informally. Jews have repeatedly fallen victim to this technique. Some stigmatizations could be seen in the sources examples cited. With the end of the Middle Ages, this did not change. Jews always remained seemingly legitimate victims. The Nazi era marked the high point. Since the publication of Sykes and Metzer's work, there have been various proposals to add to the list. For example, by adding the so-called license to sin. Violent users admit to violenting an existing norm. At the same time, however, they believe that they are acting in their spirit. The most well-known example of the Middle Ages are the Crusaders, especially the Knights' Orders. They flouted the prohibition of killing with the justification that God wanted it because the enemies were pagans. As shown above, research does see a connection between the crusading violence and that against the Jews. Another neutralization technique relevant to this thesis is the so-called waiver of claims. And this is intended to resolve the dissonance of personal identity and external identity attribution. Actually, the concept does not come from violence research, but from social psychology. Preliminary declarations are described, which serve as apologies. Person A, for example, is not an expert in the field, but still thinks that ... This example explains the waiver of claim, in this case on the expertise. For violence research, however, this term is rather unfortunate. More appropriate would be such as evasion or denial, as suggested by Lamnek, for example. However, the idea of the concept remains untouched. Obvious accusations are to be fended off by a justification that makes attribution on the basis of a personal motive impossible. Perpetrators of violence, for example, could not be anti-Semites in principle since they're Jewish friends. Users of violence thus evade by directing the origin of the action to other circumstances. As an example, the chronicle of John of Winterthur should be recalled. He did not fundamentally doubt the ability of the Jews to commit such acts, but qualified that sometimes it was only a matter of insinuations. So the chronicler did not claim that the Jews were always guilty. In this way, he justified the reports of the corresponding allegations, even though it was known that there were false accusations. All neutralization techniques are first expressed publicly, exposed, and then also serve the outside world for one's own exculpation. They may therefore be mixed with or identical with other justifications. The techniques therefore also suffer from the same problem as the outward-looking explanations. The attempt to abolish violence never works out smoothly. The violent character remains intact despite any justification. It cannot simply be erased. There is no complete discharge of debt. It may lead to counter-violence, which in turn uses the justification and/or neutralization put forward as an argument. Liebsch says that such declarations cast a shadow into the future. Accused victims, for example, may turn violent in order to undo what they consider to be the injustice they have been inflicted. The consequence may be further mixing of justifications and neutralization techniques. The perpetrator of violence is looking for additional ways to justify his behavior to himself and others. The German criminologist Herbert Jäger was the first to detach the concept of neutralization techniques from individual violence, as well as intrinsic guilt release, and transferred it to the collective level to explain macro-crime, violence as a group event. In this way, he brought together micro-sociological criminology and macro-based peace and conflict research. In this way, Jäger was able to offer theoretical explanations for mass crimes. Although he saw neutralization primarily as the moral safe exoneration of the individual, he concluded that in this way, large-scale injustice could also be rationalized. Collective values could be neutralized, for example, by blaming victims. To a large extent, this has consequences. The switched-off values themselves change. In extreme cases, for example, the application of the law to a certain group could be suspended. Thus, in addition to an inward-looking relief in the event of such a development, the neutralization technique has created an outwardly acceptable justification for further acts of violence. Overall, according to the concept, the techniques could serve as prerequisites and to stabilize collective violence. Overall, according to the concept, the techniques could serve to stabilize collective violence. They formed a unity with phenomena such as prejudice and social distance. It is striking that the neutralization technique of victim blaming occurs particularly frequently in collective violence. Research speaks of supposedly cultural legitimate goals to describe them. It is reasonable to think that this is related to the fact that the perpetrators belong to a group. Individual questions such as personal responsibility are not erased by this, but they take a backseat. Deviance justifications must be different for the collective than for individuals, since collective reasons determine the actions on which a consensus has been established. They were therefore subject to socio-structural conditions. This process of joint decision-making is indispensable for the emergence and preservation of group identity and can succeed particularly well through a negative reference group from which the collective would particularly like to distinguish itself. The collective therefore needs the culturally legitimate goals as opponents. These offer the necessary justification through their stigmatizations. At the same time, the targets become legitimate victims. A friend-foe scheme emerges that allows the use of collective and individual violence, since all moral concerns have been neutralized by blaming the opponents. In this context, it has so far remained unclear how groups can obtain the attributes to become supposedly legitimate victims and therefore the guilty. For example, research offers differentiation according to structural, that means powerlessness, and deviance related, that means membership of a minority, susceptibility as predispositions factors. As a general rule, all socially excluded or excluded groups that do not have effective protection on their own can become such victims. The medieval Jews were such culturally legitimate targets or legitimate victims. The examples from the sources given so far already shown the use of some corresponding stigmatization and exclusion. Historical research offer further examples. The so-called Endinger Judenspiel, for example, probably tried to prove that Jews were particularly eager for the blood of Christian children, especially on their highest holidays. This would have detached the ritual murders from the individual victims and connected them to the Jewish culture as a whole. The Jews would thus be legitimate targets overall. Accusations of ritual murder were also given the addition that the Jews were concerned with the mockery of Christ and his mother. For example, in Trento, this accusation appeared. In this way, the ritualized aspect of the alleged act detaches itself from murder and becomes an attack on the Christian faith as a whole. Almost all of Sykes and Metzer's naturalization techniques can be used in this way. Accordingly, this idea was invoked for a long time. Joseph Deckard wrote in 1893 that a refutation of the ritual murder legend was a covert attack on the Catholic Church. Since the 2nd century Christians have also blamed the Jews alone for the deaths of Jesus. This was connected with the accusation that they had taken possession of God himself. The Jews thus collectively became enemies of Christianity. In addition, the stereotype of the Jew as a murderer of Christians was born. Even at that time, however, anti-Jewish prejudices were not new. The writings of the Greeks already accused them of cannibalism. Although the Romans abandoned these accusations, these traditions were preserved and could be put forward again in the Middle Ages. The Jews, for their part, were quite willing to play the part of the antagonist in the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. In the 5th century, for example, the Jews polemicized against the Christians in order to make religions more distinguishable. Even before that, they insisted on the exclusivity of their faith. The competition between religions was therefore not an invention of Christianity, but was based on mutual perception. Opposition to the Jews was long and deeply rooted in Christian societies. The identification of the Jews as supposedly legitimate victims did not necessarily dissolve the feelings of guilt of the individual and the group. After all, everyday life is peaceful. In Prague, for example, Jews and Christians lived side by side for a long time without any problems. The latter even acquired real estate in the Vicus Iudariorium, that means in the district of the Jews. In the Bremen area in northern Germany, Jews first appeared as homebuyers in the 13th century. However, the first persecution is not documented until 1350. These two examples alone indicate that the latent mistrust of Christians alone was not an explanation for escalations of violence. It was an exceptional phenomenon and consequently did not always appear to be an appropriate or necessary instrument. The same applies to the idea of using the Jews throughout, quote, as an explanation for all evil. They were not enemies to be fought immediately. This speaks for two things. First, there was a certain sense of guilt, or at least a sense of problem, in connection with violence against Jews. It was clear that they could not be attacked all at the same time. Second, therefore, concrete triggers were needed that were able to transform rejection into unleashed hatred. At this point, an interesting phenomenon can be observed. Individual, powerful persons who had personal motives for hostility towards Jews constructed occasions that were appropriate for neutralizing the feelings of guilt of the collective and the individuals. The accusations of ritual murder and sacrilege against the host did not only have the task of dissolving the feelings of guilt that arose from the pure violence, they also neutralized other motives, such as the personal motives of hostility towards Jews. In particular, economic motives seem to have been of central importance. From the 12th century onwards, it was hardly possible for Jews to participate in the trade of goods. They were pushed in the lending business. It also developed into a sovereign practice to settle Jewish communities specifically for the purpose of lending money. Numerous princes were debtors. This could have a positive effect for the Jews. Charles IV, for example, issued a letter of escort for the guests of a wedding in Prague in 1351. The Jewish groom was one of the monarch's most important creditors. But the loans could also create tension between the lenders and the debtors. Innocent III, for example, demanded, as mentioned above, that the secular authorities force the Jews to forgive the Crusaders the interest on their loans. Otherwise, they should be denied any trade with Christians. Undoubtedly, the Pope acted in the interest of, and perhaps even at the request of, the departing warriors. In 1247, for example, Count Draconnet of Montauban used accusations of ritual murder over the death of the girl Mila to arrest the Jews in his sphere of influence and confiscate their property. This system seems to have been further developed. Jews were blamed so that they would buy their way out of the accusations or be robbed of their goods and then stoned. Martin V accused in the 15th century, for example. In many cases, those in power made no secret of their willingness to take advantage of the precarious situation of the Jews. The Archbishop of Cologne, Conrad, for example, had a protection privilege granted by him, paid 5 marks a year. In Strasbourg, the property of the Jews was distributed to the guilds in the course of the plague pogroms. This was also the poison that killed the Jews, according to Friedrich Klosener's Strasbourg German Chronicle written in 1362. The city and the numerous private individuals were apparently heavily indebted to the Jews, a problem that according to the source could be solved by the pogroms. All the promissory notes had been returned. What was, quote, what was owed to the Jews was all made up for. When the Jews were expelled from England in 1290 on false charges made by monks, the death penalty was originally given. Instead, the exiles were banished and confiscated in favor of the crown. If you wanted to stay and keep your possessions, you had to become a Christian. Philip IV took a similar approach in France in 1306. Jews had to convert or leave the country without their belongings. Later kings recalled the Jews only to rebuke them again. Under Charles of Valois, according to a Jewish source, there was a popular uprising in which many Jews lost first their property and then their lives. Spain was only superficially more generous in expelling the Jews in 1492. Loss of property, in addition to that of life, was officially threatened only to those who did not leave the country. However, it was forbidden to export gold, silver, coins, and special goods. So there was not much left for the Jews to take with them. After all, they could, for example, sell immovable property, such as their houses, and carry the proceeds with them without violating any of the prohibitions. Again, apparently those affected did not have any great illusions about what the actual goal was. Leading Jews are said to have negotiated with the crown to be allowed to stay in exchange for a large monetary payment. An anonymous report of the eviction describes how this deal failed only shortly before it was concluded. If the tradition is correct, the Jews were evidently aware that they would lose a large part of their wealth, so at least they would have been allowed to stay in their home country. At the same time, the source suggests that they speculated that money was the real target of the crown. Moreover, payments made by the Jews were pledged by rulers with great regularity. Rudolf of Habsburg, for example, did this in 1277. In addition, the king granted the Frankfurt Mayor Heinrich the right to collect 1 mark from all Jews who become resident in the city because of his loyalty and merits. If Jews fled, Rudolf claimed their property for himself. In 1288, the Jews are said to have paid him 20,000 marks. They were the monarch's financial reserve. This made them indispensable for the Habsburgs and other rulers, but also unpopular creditors. This is also indicated by another circumstance to which Püringer has referred. When Christians wanted to criticize their brothers and sisters in faith, they chose the Jews as a bad example. Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, complained that Christian usherers were Judaizing even worse than the Jews himself. John of Winterthur argued similarly. Christians who were rampant were even more shameful than the Jews. The audience or readers obviously understood such complaints and interpreted them as confirmation of existing stereotypes. The Erfurt Chronicle, for example, reports for the year 1349 that Jews burned themselves out of piety in order to not to have to convert in the course of the pogroms. Not even the chronicler wanted to take the accusation of poisoning the well at face value. Rather, I believe he writes, the beginning of their misfortune was the infinite amount of money that barons and knights, burghers and peasants owed them. The chronicler cannot be accused of seeing the Jews in a positive light and therefore rejecting the insinuation that the well was poisoned. Of the people who burned themselves, he wrote, "May they rest in hell." It should be noted that the chronicler may have written the sentence specifically to the sin of suicide. Nevertheless, the remark shows he saw the Jews concerned. In short, regardless of how much wealth individual Jews actually owned, many people believed they were rich. Their money aroused desires. Almost inevitably, accusations arose that the Jews were abusing their wealth. Thomas of Monmouth had already cultivated this idea in his hagiography. The Jews are said to have tried to bribe the sheriff of Norwich with 100 marks in order to get rid of their fears of persecution for their deeds. They are also said to have offered money to the bishop. In combination with the accusations of ritual murder, this resulted in an explosive mixture that interest parties could use to neutralize feelings of guilt who wanted to appropriate Jewish assets or get out of debt. At the end of the 13th century and the middle of the 14th century, there were two impressive examples of this in the empire. In 1298, the so-called Rindfleisch persecution took place in Bavaria. Mr. Kraft von Hohenlohe-Weikersheim, from whose territory the persecution originated, was heavily indebted to the Jews. They already suspected that they were in danger and therefore asked the Bishop of Würzburg for help. However, by accusing the host of sacrilege, the original lord was still able to have the Jews arrested and burned. His debts went into the fire along with his creditors. The leaders of the Armleder pogroms that took place between 1336 and 1338 were probably also indebted to the Jews. They demanded from the pledges issued for loans without anything in return. Nobles also said to have used the pogroms to excuse themselves in this way from Jews who were actually under the protection of a foreign ruler. Count Walram of Sponheim, for example, had Jews murdered whom the Archbishop of Trier would have had to defend. Accusations of ritual murder and accusations of sacrilege of the host also drove these pogroms. Money appears as a motive in only a few chronicles. In the Cologne yearbooks, for example, the Armleder pogroms are mentioned as the Battle of the Jews, but not the economic dimension. However, the knowledge of this event seems to have been only rudimentary. They were moved by the chronicler to the year 1330. He wrote about Franconia and noted that the Jews had all been beaten to death. Such brief mentions of dramatic events are not atypical. For example, there is only a brief reference to the fact that there are no more Jews in Cologne. They would have set themselves on fire. In the Lübeck-Deckmark Chronicle, they are not mentioned at all for the 13th and 14th century. This also applies to the time of the plague. At the very least, it would have been expected that the Jews would no longer be allowed to settle down after the plague, or that the council would punish other people who had allegedly spread the plague on the Trave on their behalf. These brief mentions or silence do not seem like coincidences, but all show that economic motives were incapable of neutralizing guilt. Other motives were needed. The reports from the Erfurt and Strasbourg chronicles also point in this direction. The chronicle therefore offers a remarkable source. The internal contradictions surrounding the treatments of the Jews are nowhere as tangible as here. The authors could not condemn the action, but in many cases they could not approve of it either. After all, it was not uncommon for the chroniclers to be commissioned by those in power who were supposed to work for the protection of the Jews. We owe certain messages that complete the picture exclusively to Jewish sources, since there was no room for such communication in Christian sources. In these cases, the usual source-critical restrictions must be made. They too wrote for specific addresses and had clients. The veracity must therefore be questioned. Nevertheless, the text offers an interesting perspective. This concerns, for example, the reference to the fact that Louis X had to expel the Jews from France, which was bad and unworthy because of the will of the people. A Jewish account of Trent noted that the Jews had been accused by the Christians according to their custom. The confessions extracted under torture would have made the population feel hatred against the Jews. The papal legate, who considered the accused innocent, should have fled from this popular anger. Thus, The Jews' sources do not name rulers as culprits, but the population. If this assessment is correct, it can be seen here that anti-Jewish attitudes were apparently deeply anchored in the broad masses in the late Middle Ages and could be activated. But back to the Christian sources. The Jewish accounts in the Chronicles would have put the rulers and the people alike in a bad light. Nevertheless, the violent treatment and the often base motives demanded neutralization. The Detmar Chronicle is an interesting case. It was not until the 15th century that the municipal chronicle of the leading Hanseatic city merely indicated that there were no Jews and that they were not needed. Otherwise, they are not mentioned. At the same time, the last sentence of the brief remark reflects a latent hostility towards Jews. From today's perspective, the exact reason for the non-mention can no longer be determined. The reasons can be harmless. It is possible that the chronicler did not know or did not know enough about the events to be able to incorporate them appropriately in his view. Another possibility would be deliberate concealment. This variant, if correct, was of course only available where there were few or no Jews. In the north of the empire, for example, the quote, soil for immigration was not cheap. In other areas with a larger Jewish population, the incidents were too numerous to ignore. Where the cloak of silence, or at least the deliberate scarcity of the information transmitted, were not options, excuses had to be found. This is where the aforementioned logic of the negative fall came into play. If it were possible to reinterpret violence as a legitimate punitive action, one's own conscience would be clear. At the same time, the limitation of neutralization, which actually only applies to pure acts of violence, is no longer applicable. Even the confiscation of the assets of the Jews no longer poses a moral or legal problem if alleged ritual murders stand in the way as triggers. At this point, a first interim conclusion can be drawn. The accusations of ritual murder and later the accusations of sacrilege against the host served to justify the violence against the Jews in several ways. For the collective of the perpetrators, they first allowed interpretations through which the Jews were transformed into culturally legitimate targets. The blame for the violence lay with the victims. Second, for the individual, this meant moral self-exoneration because the Jews supposedly deserved what he did to them. Thirdly, the accusations of ritual murder also concealed base motives that led to violence against the Jews. The accusations were so serious that the victims had forfeited any protective rights. And this is possible because the accusations served and embellished existing stereotypes about the Jews. At the same time, the accusations were based on the traditions that religions saw each other as adversaries. This reinforced the influence that the existing prejudices about the individual possessed. Those who were hostile to Jews anyway may have been correspondingly more receptive to accusations. Or, to return to the Streisand effect, as a multiplier of the accusations had no interest in suppressing the accusations. In order for this to work, in the long term, the ritual murder narrative had to become part of the culture of remembrance in order to be able to reproduce in this way again and again in the future. The culture of remembrance defines a group's specific way of dealing with its past. It tells us who and what we are. The substrate of what it is remembered has an identify-forming effect. This is one of the reasons why the culture of remembrance as a field of action in the historical science is considered to have particularly fruitful research potential. However, it inevitably creates differences. Those who do not feel addressed by a certain culture of remembrance do not belong to the group constituted by it. As the cultural memory, it is the narrative of the group's history. This means two things for our topic, going back to the introduction. First, the culture of remembrance can be politicized. Second, it is subject to attempts to exert influence. These are done by opinion leaders or as initiatives from the groups themselves. The question is whether this can only happen retrospectively or also through the generations that still share the living memory or the primary experience. As already mentioned, researchers are divided on this question. And this is due to the fact that if the answer is in the affirmative, it would have to be clarified how this happens. How could a culture of remembrance be developed and enforced? An answer can only be achieved by approaching the bridge of the control of the memory of later generations. In the end, research has certainly found descriptions for this subsequent influence information. Always in the collective, for example, from below or through history workshops. In general, a receptive public and discourses about interpretative competitions are also considered central. The same applies to the interaction between personal experiences, the influence of authorities, for example science, and pre-existing communal memories. Based on this approach, criteria can be derived for the attempt of participants in primary experiences to consciously create and perpetuate a culture of remembrance. These are also based on Jan Dirk Müller's work on the Gedächtnis of Maximilian I, which had a similar goal: to highlight the exaggerated depiction of one's own deeds for posterity as well as the safeguarding and renewal of historical tradition. Overall, it is about the interlocking of preservation and foundation of memory. Borrowings in the creation of the criteria were also taken from Robert Clue's analysis of the culture of remembrance over the centuries with regard to Martin Luther. Here they are. A certain narrative is formed which is supposed to be decisive for later memory. The ability is there to find a public for remembrance. There is a fundamental openness of other people to the interpretation of the narrative. Ideally, it is a matter of steadily growing acceptance of the broad masses. This aim is to secure the transmission. There is recognizable desire for competing interpretations and events to be forgotten. Opinion leaders and initiatives from the group of lived memory or primary experience shape the narrative. There is convergence of individual and collective memory goals. This is especially true for individualists who can generate publicity as multipliers. A list of these criteria is certainly not complete, is worth discussing in detail. Nevertheless, it creates a viable framework for tracing and evaluating processes and actions from the point of view of trying to develop a specific culture of remembrance in connection with this topic. The narrative of the bearers of medieval hostility towards Jews is formed by the ritual murder legend with the blood accusations, the accusations of sacrilege against the hosts, and the other conspiracy narratives. The fact that a public sphere has been created is already shown by the wide dissemination and the involvement of the elites with the accusations. Even in the sources, this attempt can still be grasped. Eventually, the accusations were handed down in the chronicles, trial transcripts, and narrative literature. In this way, the striving for the certainty of tradition is recognizable, as it were. The broad masses were apparently ready to acknowledge the narrative and carry it forward. In addition to the dissemination, the longevity of the allegations is a testimony to this. Even reactionaries in post-communist Russia, for example, declared that the last Tsar, Nicholas II, had fallen victim to a Jewish ritual murder. The evidence that competing interpretations and events should be forgotten has already been presented above. The disregard of the prohibitions as well as the protective privileges of the popes, emperors, and other rulers bear witness to this. The same applies to the contributions of opinion leaders or the initiatives from the group of people of lived memory. Thomas of Menmouth primarily wanted to create a martyr, but he was absolutely willing to accept that the story of the ritual murder would be spread. The same applies to the works that followed him. Therefore, there was also a convergence between the individual and the collective memory goals. The individual, just like the group, had an interest in identical memory. Otherwise, the neutralization technique of victimization would fail for the individual and the collective. The fact that some Jews had not committed the crimes with which they were accused was therefore of no consequence. They were, after all, apparently guilty in general. All the building blocks for the anchoring and perpetuation of the accusations of ritual murder and the other accusations as a permissible justification for violence against Jews or hostility to Jews in general are accordingly available. However, the descriptions so far are also reminiscent of propaganda, which requires very similar building blocks. However, the fact that hagiographies with the aim of creating martyr cults were at the beginning distinguishes the attempt at control remembrance from it. Propaganda seeks to influence the opinions, behaviors, and attitudes of specific target groups for political purposes. This is done primarily with a view to the respective present and not to the medium and long-term memories. Propaganda is also initiated and carried out by political actors. The accusations of ritual murder and sacrilege against the host therefore unquestionably developed into propaganda in the course of time. However, they possessed and still have a wider horizon. It is no longer necessary to influence opinions and attitudes. The anchoring and consolidation in the collective memory has ensured that, if desired, various forms of hostility against Jews could be activated, even to the point of deadly violence. Instead of merely influencing certain large groups, their ability to control was achieved. At this point, it is important to return to the questions mentioned in the introduction, which have not yet been clarified by research. The most important answer is, it is a consequence of the violence against the Jews in the Middle Ages that the ritual murder legend has survived to the present day and is still an important thought structure of anti-Semitism. Even then, this demanded admissible justifications. The original legitimacy did not last. Hostility towards Jews erupted violently for the first time as a byproduct of the Crusades, which made violence against opponents of the faith an acceptable tool. Almost inevitably, therefore, the focus turned to the representatives of the religions, which already saw itself as a competitor to Christianity. However, the privileges of protection and prohibitions of the use of force by the elites, and in particular by the Holy See, ensured that these justifications could not stand. What was needed was legitimacy that would allow the individual and the group to disregard these commandments. The latter had to be able to neutralize the escalating violence, the associated feelings of guilt, and possibly also less noble motives for the action. The ritual murder legend, invented for other reasons, offered just that. The Jews were accused by it of a crime that ultimately seemed to be directed against the divine order itself. Children as victims added to the severity. The Jews were chosen as culprits because they had the necessary victim attributes for the narrative to be accepted by the masses. The apparently familiar stereotypes used by of Menmouth and those who came after him point in this direction. However, neutralization could only work in the long term if the accusations of ritual murder and the associated accusations were valid as legitimation. Bans by those in power could therefore only come to nothing. This led to a fateful cycle, or the upward spiral mentioned in the introduction. With each new act of violence in the name of the ritual murder legend, it became all the more important to anchor it as a fact for all eternity. It had to be perpetuated in the general culture of remembrance and become a tradition of remembrance believed to exist forever. However, this circumstance led to more and more violence. In the end, the accusations were deeply etched into the cultural memory. Doubting them was seen as an attack. Whether this mechanism can be completely dissolved remains to be seen.